The June heat hung over New Orleans like a funeral shroud, thick and unmoving. On Chartres Street, where the cobblestones still held the warmth of the day, Judge Alistair Crane stepped from his townhouse into the violet dusk. His carriage waited, black lacquer gleaming in the gaslight, drawn by horses that knew the route without direction. He didn't tell his wife where he was going. He never did. "Belle Chêne," he murmured to the driver, and the man nodded once, silent as a confessor. The carriage rolled forward, wheels clicking against stone, carrying him away from the respectable corridors of law and order toward something older, darker, more true. Crane was not alone in his journey. Along the river road, other carriages emerged from plantation drives and city estates. Colonel Marcus Dupont from his military quarters, Senator Armand Lavaux from his mansion on Esplanade, Merchant Prince Cornelius Whitmore from his warehouse empire on the docks. Men of power, men of influence, men whose signatures shaped the fate of thousands, all bound for the same destination. Belle Chêne sat 12 miles upriver from New Orleans, a Greek revival masterpiece rising from the sugarcane fields like a temple to wealth itself. White columns soared 2 stories high, supporting galleries wrapped in wrought iron so delicate it looked like frozen lace. Live oaks, older than memory, formed a cathedral approach, their branches draped with Spanish moss that swayed in the breeze like the hair of drowned women. The estate had belonged to the Beauregard family for 3 generations. After the war that wasn't yet called a war, after yellow fever took her husband Captain Jean-Baptiste Beauregard at 38, the plantation fell to his widow, Evangeline Beauregard, Madame Beauregard to those who sought her favor. She was 42 years old and more dangerous than any woman in Louisiana. Judge Crane's carriage turned through the iron gates, wrought with roses and thorns intertwined, and joined the procession up the shell-paved drive. Through the windows, he glimpsed the other guests arriving in their finery: silk waistcoats, gold watch chains, beaver top hats, cravats pinned with gems that cost more than a human life, because that's what they'd come to purchase. Tell me in the comments which country you are from and what you thought of this story. And if this story made an impression on you, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any future stories. Not with money. Money was too crude, too traceable. They came to purchase with silence, with complicity, with the kind of shared sin that bound men together, tighter than any contract. The carriages halted before the grand entrance. Footmen in cream livery opened doors, extended gloved hands. But these footmen were different from those who served at ordinary plantations. Their eyes were carefully vacant, their expressions smoothed of all emotion. They had been trained not to see, not to hear, not to remember. Judge Crane stepped down, his boots crunching on oyster shells. The night air smelled of jasmine and river water and something underneath. Something metallic and wrong that he'd learned not to question. "Good evening, Your Honor." The voice belonged to Baptiste, Madame Beauregard's butler, a tall man whose mixed heritage showed in his amber eyes and coffee-colored skin, free papers in his pocket, chains around his loyalty. A madame awaits in the gallery. Inside, Belle Chêne was a vision of southern grandeur. Crystal chandeliers scattered light across marble floors imported from Italy. Portraits of Beauregard ancestors gazed down with aristocratic indifference. The furniture was French, the carpets Persian, the silver Georgian. Everything spoke of taste, breeding, civilization. Everything was a lie. The guests gathered in the second-floor gallery, where tall windows opened onto the night and the Mississippi rolled past like a dark prophecy. Servants moved among them offering champagne in crystal flutes, brandy in cut-glass snifters. Colonel Dupont laughed too loudly at something Senator Lavaux whispered. Cornelius Whitmore stood alone by the window, staring at his reflection in the glass. They were all waiting. At precisely 9 o'clock, the double doors at the gallery's end swung open, and Evangeline Beauregard made her entrance. She moved like music given form. Her gown was the color of old blood, burgundy silk that caught the candlelight and transformed it into something liquid and alive. Her black hair was piled high in the fashion of the day, revealing a neck that seemed too long, too graceful, too serpentine. Diamonds glittered at her throat, each stone the size of a tear. But it was her eyes that held them, green as Spanish moss, green as poison, green as the deep water that drowned men who ventured too far from shore. "Gentlemen," she said, and her voice had the quality of velvet draped over steel, "welcome to Belle Chêne. Welcome to the Ceremony of Renewal." She descended the 3 steps into the gallery like a queen approaching her subjects. The men straightened, preened, competed silently for her attention. Judge Crane found himself smoothing his waistcoat, touching his cravat, feeling suddenly inadequate in ways his courtroom never made him feel. "You honor me with your presence," Evangeline continued, moving among them with practiced grace. She touched Judge Crane's sleeve, just a brush of fingertips, but he felt it like a brand. Alistair, still carrying the weight of justice on those distinguished shoulders. "Someone must, madame." "Indeed." Her smile was a knife wrapped in silk. "And you, Colonel, how fares our glorious military? Strong, madame, ready to defend our way of life against all enemies." "All enemies," she repeated softly, and something in her tone made the hair rise on Crane's neck. "How fortunate we are to have such protectors." She moved on, greeting each guest by name, by title, by secret. She knew their wives' names, their children's ages, their financial troubles, their political ambitions. She knew everything because knowledge was power, and power was the only currency that mattered in this room. When she'd made the circuit, she returned to the center of the gallery. Behind her, the windows framed the rising moon, full and fat, and the color of old bone. "Tonight," Evangeline said, her voice dropping to something that might have been prayer or might have been curse, "we gather as we have gathered for 3 years now, not as strangers, but as initiates, not as citizens of a changing world, but as guardians of eternal truth." The men leaned forward, hungry for her words. "Out there," she gestured toward the windows, toward New Orleans, toward the world beyond the iron gates. "They speak of equality, of abolition, of the end of our way of life. They say we are sinners, that we will be judged, that history will condemn us." Her smile grew sharp. "Let them speak. Let them preach. Let them write their pamphlets and pass their laws in capitals far from the heat and the soil and the truth of this land, because they do not understand what we understand. They have not tasted what we have tasted." She paused, letting the words settle like sediment in wine. "Power," she whispered, "not the power of votes or laws or commerce, the power of dominion, the power of one human being over another, complete and absolute, the power that transforms us from men into gods." Judge Crane felt his pulse quicken. Around him the other guests shifted, breathed faster, showed teeth in what might have been smiles. 3 years ago," Evangeline continued, "I extended this invitation to a select few, men of vision, men who understood that civilization requires hierarchy, that order requires subordination, that paradise itself had masters and servants." She began to walk again, circling them like a priestess around a sacrifice. "I offered you a ceremony, a ritual, a space where the masks we wear in daylight could be removed, where the desires we suppress could be expressed, where the power we wield could be celebrated in its purest form." Her hand trailed along the back of a settee, fingers ghosting over velvet. "And you accepted. Month after month, full moon after full moon, you have come to Belle Chêne. You have participated in the ceremony of renewal. You have reminded yourselves," her voice hardened, "of who you are, what you are, what you will always be." Thunder rumbled in the distance. Through the windows, Crane saw clouds building on the southern horizon, black against the stars. "Tonight," Evangeline said, "the moon is full. The ceremony awaits. But first," she turned to face them fully, her expression suddenly serious, "I must ask, are there any among you who wish to leave, any who have lost their nerve, their conviction, their understanding of necessity?" Silence. Not one man moved toward the door. "Good," she said softly, "because tonight's ceremony will be special. Tonight I have prepared something extraordinary." She clapped her hands once, sharp as a gunshot. The doors opened. Baptiste entered, followed by 6 enslaved men and women. They were young, beautiful, dressed in white linen that made them look like sacrifices in some ancient temple. Their eyes were downcast, their movements carefully trained. But Crane noticed something different tonight. A tension in their shoulders, a tightness around their mouths. Fear was nothing new. Fear was part of the ceremony, part of the pleasure. But this felt deeper, colder, more like the fear before an execution than before a violation. "These 6," Evangeline said, walking among the enslaved like a general inspecting troops, "have been prepared according to the old ways, fasted, purified, instructed in their sacred duty to serve their masters in all things." She stopped before a young woman, perhaps 19, with skin like polished mahogany and eyes that stayed fixed on the floor. "This is Delphine. She was born on this plantation. Her mother served my late husband's father. She has known no other home, no other purpose than to serve the Beauregard family." Evangeline touched the girl's chin, tilted her face up. "Look at them, Delphine. Look at the men who own this world." Slowly, reluctantly, the girl raised her eyes. Crane saw tears trembling on her lashes, saw her jaw clench against whatever words she wanted to speak. "These men are not your enemies," Evangeline continued, still holding the girl's face. "They are not your oppressors. They are the natural order made flesh, the hand of God in human form, and tonight you will help them remember their divinity." She released the girl and turned back to the guests. "Gentlemen, shall we adjourn to the chapel?" The word sent a thrill through the room. The chapel, the inner sanctum, the place where the ceremony truly began. They moved as a group, following Evangeline through the house, down the grand staircase, through the dining room where a feast waited, oysters and game birds and wine from France. But they would eat later, after. Everything was better after. Out through the French doors, across the manicured lawn, past the garden where roses bloomed white as bone in the moonlight. The chapel sat 200 yards from the main house, a small Greek revival building that had once served as the family's private place of worship. Now it served a different god. Evangeline produced a key from somewhere in the folds of her gown. The lock clicked. The door swung open on hinges that had been oiled to silence. Inside, the chapel had been transformed. The pews had been removed. The altar remained, but now it was draped in crimson velvet. Candles burned in iron sconces bolted to the walls, dozens of them, hundreds, casting shadows that moved like living things. And in the center of the room, a circle had been painted on the floor, not in paint, in ash. Judge Crane stared at it, feeling something cold move through his chest. He'd attended the ceremonies before. He'd participated in acts that would see him hanged if they ever came to light. But he'd never seen the ash circle. "Tonight," Evangeline said, her voice echoing strangely in the chapel's acoustics, "we go deeper. Tonight we seal our pact not just in flesh but in spirit. Tonight we bind ourselves to this truth so completely that no law, no conscience, no God himself can tear us free." She gestured to Baptiste, who stepped forward with a silver tray. On it lay a knife. Old, ceremonial, its handle wrapped in leather darkened by time and use. "Each of you will make an offering," Evangeline said, lifting the knife. "A drop of blood, given freely, mixed with the ash of those who served before us. Their submission made permanent, our dominion made eternal." Colonel Dupont laughed nervously. "Madame, this seems rather what, Colonel?" Her eyes fixed on him, green and merciless, rather serious, rather permanent, rather real. She moved toward him, knife gleaming in candlelight. "Is that not why you came? To feel something real, to touch something true beneath all the pretense and propriety?" The colonel swallowed but didn't back away. Couldn't. To refuse now would be to admit weakness, to lose face. to become less than these other men. Of course, madame. Forgive my hesitation. There is nothing to forgive, she said gently, almost kindly. Only to remember, and tonight we will all remember together. Thunder rumbled again, closer now. Through the chapel's high windows, Crane saw lightning fork across the sky. The storm was coming, and with it, he would later swear, came something else, something that had been waiting in the darkness between worlds, watching through the eyes of the enslaved, counting every sin, recording every crime, something that had finally decided it was time to collect. But in that moment, as Evangeline raised the knife and the guests formed a line to receive their mark, Judge Alistair Crane felt only anticipation, only hunger, only the terrible, intoxicating certainty that he was about to touch something forbidden and emerge transformed. He was right about the transformation, just not the way he imagined. The first to step forward was Senator Armand Laveau. He was the eldest among them at 56. His hair silver at the temples, his face lined with the weight of legislative decisions that had shaped Louisiana's slave codes into instruments of absolute control. He'd written 3 of the laws himself, penned in elegant script that disguised their cruelty beneath legal terminology. Evangeline took his hand with the tenderness of a lover. She turned it palm up, exposing the pale underside of his wrist, where blue veins traced rivers beneath skin that had never known labor, never known chains. "Do you consent, Senator?" Her voice was ritual now, formal as liturgy. "I consent." The knife bit quick and clean. A single drop of blood welled up, crimson as rubies. Evangeline caught it on her fingertip and carried it to the ash circle, where she pressed it into the grey powder. The blood spread, darkening the ash, and for a moment, just a moment, Crane could have sworn he saw the circle pulse with light. But then it was gone, and he convinced himself it was only candlelight playing tricks. One by one, the men approached. Colonel DuPont, whose military career was built on crushing slave rebellions with such brutality that even his fellow officers whispered concerns. Cornelius Whitmore, whose ships had brought 10,000 Africans across the Middle Passage before the trade was outlawed, and who still found ways to profit from human cargo through creative paperwork. Dr. Émile Rousseau, who conducted medical experiments on enslaved people without anesthesia, recording their screams as data. Magistrate Thaddeus Moore, who'd sentenced runaways to punishment so severe that other judges looked away. And finally, Judge Alistair Crane himself. When his turn came, Crane found his hand trembling slightly. Not from fear, he told himself it wasn't fear, but from excitement. From the thrill of transgression, of stepping beyond the boundaries that constrained ordinary men. The knife stung less than he'd expected. His blood looked the same as Laveau's, as all of theirs, red and human and mortal. Evangeline pressed it into the ash circle, and this time Crane was watching closely. He saw nothing unusual, no pulse of light, no supernatural sign, just blood soaking into ash, mixing into a paste the color of dried mud. "It is done," Evangeline announced, setting the knife aside. "The offering is made, the circle is sealed. Now let the ceremony of renewal begin." She nodded to Baptiste, who opened the chapel's side door. The 6 enslaved people were led in, still dressed in their white linen, still moving with that strange tension Crane had noticed earlier. They were positioned around the room, not in the ash circle, but near it, close enough that the guests could move between them like diners at a feast, sampling different courses. "Gentlemen," Evangeline said, her voice dropping to something almost intimate, "the night is yours. These vessels have been prepared for your pleasure, for your dominion, for your reminder of the natural order that governs all things." She moved to the altar where she reclined on the crimson velvet like a pagan priestess presiding over fertility rites. "I will watch," she said simply. "I will bear witness. And when you have finished, when you have renewed yourselves in the ancient truth of power, we will feast together as brothers in understanding." For a moment, no one moved. The guests looked at each other, at the enslaved people standing silent and still, at Evangeline on her altar throne. Then Senator Laveau stepped forward toward Delphine, the girl Evangeline had singled out earlier, and the ceremony began. Crane turned away, moving toward the windows. He'd participated in these ceremonies before, yes. He'd rationalized them as necessary, as the price of maintaining social order, as no different than the 1,000 other violences that built civilization. But tonight, something felt different. Maybe it was the storm building outside, the thunder that seemed to echo in his chest. Maybe it was the ash circle that seemed to pull at the corner of his vision. Maybe it was the way the enslaved people's eyes looked, not vacant as they'd been trained, but aware, fully, terribly aware. Behind him, he heard the sounds begin. Fabric tearing, breathing growing ragged, the wet sounds of flesh on flesh, and underneath it all, something else, a humming, low and rhythmic, coming from the enslaved people themselves. Crane turned back. They were all humming the same note, the same tone, even as the guests used them, even as Colonel Dupont forced a young man to his knees, even as Dr. Rousseau studied the reactions of his victim with clinical detachment, even as Magistrate Moore exercised the same cruel authority he wielded from the bench. The humming grew louder. "Silence them!" Colonel Dupont snapped, but the humming continued. Evangeline rose from the altar, frowning. "Baptiste, what is this?" The butler stepped forward, confusion crossing his usually impassive face. "Madame, I don't understand." They were instructed. "Silence them!" the colonel roared, striking the young man across the face. The humming didn't stop. If anything, it grew stronger, rising into something that might have been a song, might have been a prayer, might have been a curse in a language older than English, older than French, older than any tongue the guests would recognize. The candles flickered, though there was no wind. "Evangeline," Crane heard himself say, his voice strange in his own ears, "we should leave." "Don't be absurd," she replied, but he heard uncertainty in her tone now. "They're simply trying to disrupt." The first candle went out, then another, then a dozen at once, darkness spreading across the chapel like blood through water. "Light them again," Evangeline commanded. But Baptiste stood frozen, staring at something Crane couldn't see. Thunder cracked directly overhead, so loud it shook the chapel walls. Through the windows, lightning illuminated the landscape in stark white flashes, and in those flashes, Crane saw figures standing outside, dozens of them, hundreds. Enslaved people from Belle Chêne and the neighboring plantations, gathered in the rain that had started to fall, gathered in silence, watching. "Dear God," Magistrate Moore whispered. Another candle went out, and another. The darkness pressed in, thick as velvet, suffocating as smoke. In the dying light, Crane saw the enslaved people in the chapel raising their hands, not in supplication, not in surrender, but in something that looked like benediction, like calling down power from a source the guests had never acknowledged. The humming became words, African words mixed with French patois, invoking names that made Crane's skin crawl. Dambala, Erzuli, Baron Samedi. The Loa of voodoo that every white person in Louisiana pretended didn't exist, while secretly fearing them in the dark. "This is ridiculous," Colonel Dupont snarled, pulling his pistol from his coat. "I'll silence them myself." Lightning struck. Not near the chapel. Not close to it, directly on it on the peaked roof with a crack like the world splitting open. The sound was deafening, the light was blinding. Crane felt electricity surge through the air, through his body, every hair standing on end, every nerve screaming. When his vision cleared, he saw fire. It spread from the roof beams with impossible speed, racing along the wooden supports, licking at the walls, finding the curtains and consuming them in seconds. The heat hit like a physical blow. "Out!" Evangeline screamed. "Everyone out!" The guests scrambled for the door, all dignity forgotten, all pretense stripped away. They were just animals now, frightened animals running from the flames, but the 6 enslaved people didn't run. They stood in their white linen in the center of the ash circle, still humming, still chanting, as fire bloomed around them like flowers. Crane grabbed Delphine's arm. "Come on, you'll die!" She looked at him with eyes that held no fear, only something that might have been pity. "We were already dead," she said quietly. "You just didn't see it." Then she pulled free and returned to the circle, to her companions, to the fire that now engulfed them all. Crane ran. Out the chapel door, into the rain that fell in sheets, into chaos. The other guests were scattering to their carriages. Baptiste was shouting orders to form a bucket line, but the enslaved people who'd gathered just stood there, watching the chapel burn, singing the same song as those inside. Evangeline stood in the rain, barefoot. When had she lost her shoes? Staring at the flames. Her carefully arranged hair had come loose, hanging in wet ropes around her face. Her burgundy gown was plastered to her body. "No," she whispered. "No. No, no!" The chapel roof collapsed with a roar, sending sparks spiraling into the night sky. The rain should have slowed the fire, but it seemed to feed it instead, the flames growing hotter, brighter, more intense. Crane reached his carriage, shouted at his driver to leave immediately. As they pulled away, he looked back once. Evangeline was still standing there, rain and firelight playing across her face. And around her, in a circle, the enslaved people of Belle Chêne stood watching their mistress watch her temple burn. In the flames, Crane could have sworn he saw 6 figures still standing, still humming, still calling down something that had been waiting a very long time to answer. By dawn, the chapel was ash and twisted metal. The rain had finally stopped around 4 in the morning, leaving the grounds of Belle Chêne steaming in the early heat. The air thick with the smell of wet char and something sweeter, more terrible, burned flesh. Judge Crane hadn't slept. He'd returned to his New Orleans townhouse, dismissed his driver with a generous payment and strict instructions to forget where they'd been, and spent the night in his study with a bottle of bourbon that barely touched the cold fear crystallizing in his gut. He kept seeing Delphine's eyes. We were already dead. When sunlight finally filtered through his curtains, he felt relief wash over him. Morning meant rationality. Morning meant the clear light of day to burn away supernatural fears and late-night imaginings. The fire had been an accident, lightning strike, unfortunate timing, nothing more. The humming had been some kind of coordinated resistance, clever, but ultimately futile. The figures he'd seen in the flames were tricks of smoke and guilt. Guilt he could manage. Guilt was familiar. He washed, dressed in fresh clothes, and descended to breakfast. His wife Margaret was already at the table, reading a letter from her sister in Charleston. She looked up when he entered, her round face creasing with concern. "Alistair, you look dreadful. Are you ill?" "A late night at the club," he lied smoothly. "Tedious political discussions that dragged on longer than expected." "You should rest more. You're not a young man anymore." He was 43 and felt every year of it this morning. "Yes, dear." He sat, accepted coffee from their house slave, Samuel, tried to focus on the newspaper, but the words swam before his eyes, meaningless black marks on white paper. His wrist itched. He scratched absently, still trying to read about cotton prices and railroad expansion. The itch persisted, intensified. Frowning, he pushed up his sleeve. Where Evangeline had cut him, where his blood had mixed with ash in the circle, the small wound had closed. But around it, spreading in a perfect circle about 2 inches across, his skin had darkened, not bruised, darkened. Grey as ash, grey as storm clouds, grey as the face of a drowned man. Crane stared at it, his coffee forgotten. "Alistair?" Margaret's voice seemed to come from very far away. "What's wrong?" "Nothing," he said quickly, pulling his sleeve down. "Just a mark. Must have bumped into something last night." But his hands were shaking as he raised his cup. The mark burned. Across the city, in his military quarters on Barrack Street, Colonel Marcus DuPont woke to agony. He'd made it home around midnight, changed into his nightshirt, taken laudanum to help him sleep. But the pain in his wrist had woken him 3 hours later, burning like someone was holding a hot coal against his skin. By morning light, he examined the wound in his shaving mirror. The same grey circle, the same unnatural colour, spreading from the small cut like rot in timber. He tried to wash it off. The grey didn't budge. He tried to scrub it with his shaving brush. The skin beneath grew raw, but the mark remained. He wrapped it in bandages and told his Batman that he'd burned himself on a lamp. But throughout the morning, as he tried to conduct his duties, the pain grew worse. The bandages grew warm, then hot, then so scorching that he had to remove them. The mark had spread. It was now 3 inches across and growing. Senator Armand Laveau's wife found him unconscious in his study at noon. He'd been at his desk, trying to draft a response to correspondence from Washington regarding proposed federal oversight of state slave codes. But the pain had overwhelmed him. The mark on his wrist had spread to his entire forearm, grey and hot and wrong. The doctor was called. He examined the arm, frowning deeply. "Senator, this appears to be some kind of chemical burn, but I've never seen anything quite like it. The tissue is damaged, but there's no blistering, no char. It's as if the pigmentation itself is changing. Can you treat it?" The doctor hesitated. "I can try a poultice, but I'll be honest, I don't know what I'm treating." By evening, the mark had reached Laveau's elbow. One by one, the guests from the ceremony sought medical help. One by one, the doctors found themselves baffled. The marks weren't burns, weren't infections, weren't anything in their medical textbooks. They spread like stains, crawling up arms toward hearts, and they burned with a heat that no compress could cool. And as the marks spread, the guests began to see things. Colonel DuPont, alone in his quarters, saw Delphine standing in the corner of his room, not burned, not dead, but whole and accusing. When he blinked, she was gone. Magistrate Moore woke from a laudanum haze to find his bedroom filled with the enslaved people he'd sentenced to punishment over the years. They stood around his bed in silence, just watching. When his wife entered with more medicine, they vanished like smoke. Dr. Rousseau saw his victims in every reflective surface, in windows, in mirrors, in the surface of his morning coffee. Their faces twisted in the pain he'd caused them, studying him the way he'd studied them. Judge Crane saw them everywhere. In his courtroom, sitting in the gallery, walking past his townhouse, standing in his garden. The dead and the living, the violated and the broken, all wearing the same expression of patient waiting. They were waiting for something. On the 3rd day after the fire, Crane received a message delivered by a street urchin. The note was written in elegant script on expensive paper. "The others are dying. You will too, unless you come to Belle Chêne. Come alone. Come now." E.B. Crane's hands trembled as he read it. The mark had spread to his shoulder now. His entire arm was grey and burning, and the pain was becoming unbearable. The laudanum barely touched it anymore. He had no choice. He took his carriage upriver, alone this time, in the bright afternoon light. The river road stretched before him, lined with plantations that looked peaceful in the summer heat, white houses, green fields, the Mississippi rolling past like nothing had changed, like the world was still what it had always been. But Crane knew better now. The gates of Belle Chêne stood open. The shell drive was empty of carriages. As he approached the main house, he saw enslaved people working in the gardens, but they moved differently than before. Their heads were up, their eyes met his, and none of them looked away. Baptiste met him at the door. The butler's face was drawn, exhausted, but his amber eyes held something that might have been satisfaction. "Judge Crane, Madame is expecting you. This way." He led Crane not to the gallery or the parlour, but through the house to Evangeline's private study. It was a room Crane had never seen before, smaller than the public spaces, lined with books, dominated by a massive desk covered in correspondence and ledgers. Evangeline sat behind the desk. She looked like she'd aged 10 years in 3 days. Her face was pale, her hair hastily pinned, dark circles under those green eyes that had once mesmerized an entire room. And her right arm from wrist to shoulder was completely grey. "Sit down, Alistair," she said, her voice rough with exhaustion and pain. He sat. "Tell me you know what's happening," he said. "Tell me you can stop it." "I know what's happening," she replied. "As for stopping it," she laughed, bitter as poison, "I don't think that's possible." "What do you mean?" "Evangeline, for God's sake, for God's sake," she laughed again, harsher. "Is that what we were doing in the chapel? Working for God's sake?" Crane said nothing. Evangeline stood, moving to the window. Outside, the ruins of the chapel were visible, a blackened skeleton against green lawns. "I was 7 years old when my mother brought me to Belle Chêne," she said quietly. "My father had died of cholera in the city. We had nothing, but my mother had been beautiful once, beautiful enough that Jean-Baptiste Beauregard's father took her as a mistress. I grew up in this house, neither family nor servant, neither white nor willing to acknowledge any other heritage." Crane frowned, understanding dawning. "You're mixed," she said flatly. "My grandmother was an enslaved woman from Saint-Domingue. She knew the old ways, the old gods. She taught my mother, and my mother taught me before Belle Chêne swallowed her whole." She turned back to face him. "When I married Jean-Baptiste, I thought I'd escaped. I'd become white enough, rich enough, powerful enough, but you can't escape blood, Alistair. You can only decide what you do with it." "The ceremony," Crane whispered. What were you doing?" "Trying to bind them," Evangeline said. "The lower, the spirits my grandmother worshipped. I thought if I gave them enough offerings, enough pain, enough violation of those they protect, I could control them. Use their power to maintain my position, my wealth, my security." Her laugh was ragged. "I was wrong. You can't control them. You can only awaken them. And that night when lightning struck the chapel, when those 6 offered themselves willingly as vessels," she closed her eyes. "They didn't die, Alistair. They transcended." And the lower answered. "This is insanity," Crane said, but his voice shook. "Voodoo is superstition, primitive nonsense. Look at your arm and tell me it's nonsense." He couldn't. "The mark," Evangeline continued, "is judgment. Each of us who participated in the ceremonies, who spilled blood in that circle, is now marked for payment. The spirits are collecting what's owed. And the payment is what? Our lives. Worse than that." She met his eyes. "Our souls. When the mark reaches your heart, and it will, Alistair, it's spreading faster every day, you'll die. But not peacefully. Not in your sleep. You'll die with every face you've wronged, every person you've violated or condemned or broken standing over you. And then they'll take you down to where the lower keep the unrepentant. Forever." Crane stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. No, I don't accept this. There has to be a way to stop it, to reverse it." "There is one way," Evangeline said quietly. He turned to her, desperate. "What? Tell me." "Confession, true confession. Not to a priest, not to God, to them, to the ones we harmed. You have to face every person you've wronged through your power, every enslaved person you've condemned or sold or violated. You have to speak their names, acknowledge what you did, accept responsibility. And then you have to spend the rest of your life, however long that is, making amends." "That's impossible," Crane said. "I don't even remember them all. And half are dead or sold away." "Then you'll die with the mark on your heart." Her voice was flat. "That's the choice. The only choice." They stood in silence for a long moment. "What about you?" Crane finally asked. "Will you confess?" Evangeline looked down at her grey arm, at the mark that had almost reached her chest. "I don't know if I can," she whispered. "I've done so much, Alistair. So very much. The ceremonies were only the latest. For years I've used them, broken them, sold them like furniture. I don't know if there's enough time left for all I'd have to confess." Then we're damned, most likely. She smiled tiredly, though I suppose the damned should go down with some dignity. But there was no dignity in what was coming. They both knew it. The deaths began on the 5th day after the fire. Cornelius Whitmore was the first. The mark had spread to his chest, covering his heart in that unnatural grey. His servants found him in his warehouse on the docks, collapsed among bales of cotton that bore the stains of human suffering, cotton picked by hands that bled, processed by children who should have been playing, shipped in holds that had once carried human cargo. He was still alive when they found him, still conscious, but he wasn't alone. The dock workers, most of them enslaved or free people of color, reported that Whitmore was speaking to people who weren't there, arguing with them, begging them, screaming names in languages he shouldn't have known. Igbo, Yoruba, Fon. Please, he kept saying. Please, I didn't know. I was just doing business. It wasn't personal. But apparently, it had been very personal to them. When the doctor finally arrived, Whitmore's eyes had gone wide with terror, fixed on something hovering just above him. His last words were, "No, not there. Please, not there." Then his heart stopped. The mark on his chest glowed briefly, bright as candlelight, before fading to dull grey, and every person in that warehouse swore they heard voices. Dozens of them, hundreds maybe, singing in triumph as Cornelius Whitmore's soul was dragged down to judgment. Dr. Émile Rousseau tried to cut the mark out. In his private surgery, with a mirror positioned so he could see his own chest, he made careful incisions around the grey tissue. His hands were steady. They'd performed worse on unwilling subjects, but when his scalpel touched the mark, the grey spread faster. It raced up the blade, up his hand, up his arm, covering healthy flesh in seconds. Rousseau screamed and dropped the scalpel. The mark continued to spread, accelerating, eating across his chest and down his stomach, turning his skin the color of ash, the color of judgment, the color of payment due. He ran from his surgery into the street, half-dressed, bleeding from his self-inflicted wounds. People scattered before him, horrified by his appearance. "Help me!" he screamed. "Someone help me!" But no one would touch him. They could see the spirits around him, the enslaved people he'd vivisected in the name of medical advancement, the children he'd infected with diseases to study their progression, the women he'd sterilized without consent or anesthesia. They circled him like sharks, patient and implacable. Rousseau made it 3 blocks before he collapsed in the street. The mark had reached his face, turning his features grey, making him look like a statue carved from storm clouds. His last words were clinical, analytical, even in death. "Fascinating. The progression is exponential. If only I could document." Then the spirits took him, and his documentation ended. Magistrate Thaddeus Moore barricaded himself in his home. He'd seen what happened to Whitmore and Rousseau. He understood that the mark was death, that the spirits were coming, that there was no medical solution and no legal defense against what he'd done. So he locked every door, bolted every window, and waited with a loaded pistol in his study. The mark covered half his torso now. It burned constantly, a fire that no amount of laudanum could dull. He'd stopped sleeping, couldn't sleep, because every time he closed his eyes, he saw them, all of them. Every runaway he'd sentenced to maiming, every family he'd ordered separated, every punishment he'd prescribed that went beyond law into sadism. They were patient. They had eternity now. On the 7th day, his wife tried to bring him food. She knocked on the study door, calling his name, begging him to let her in. "Go away," he shouted. "Just go away. Take the children and leave this house. Leave the city. Don't come back." "Thaddeus, please," I said, "go." He heard her crying on the other side of the door, heard her footsteps retreating. Good. At least they might escape. At least his sins might not stain them. But the spirits didn't care about his family. They only wanted him. They came through the walls. Moore saw them materialize like smoke, gaining substance, men, women, children, all wearing the scars he'd inflicted through his judicial authority. They filled his study, pressed in around his desk, and their eyes held no mercy because he'd shown them none. "Stay back," he warned, raising the pistol. "I'll shoot. I swear I'll—" But what good was a pistol against the dead? They didn't touch him. They didn't need to. They just stood there, bearing witness as the mark completed its journey to his heart. Moore felt it reach his center, felt something cold wrap around his beating heart and squeeze. The pain was exquisite, beyond anything his body had ever experienced. But worse than the pain was the knowing. The sudden, absolute understanding of every consequence of every decision he'd made, every life destroyed by his cruelty disguised as law. He felt all of it. Simultaneously, completely, the pistol fell from his hand. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "God help me, I'm sorry." But it was too late for sorry, too late by decades. His heart stopped, and the spirits claimed him. Colonel Marcus DuPont tried to run. Of all the guests, he was perhaps the most pragmatic. He saw the pattern. The mark spreads, the spirits come, death follows. Simple military logic suggested a simple military solution: retreat. Preserve your forces. Fight another day. He arranged transportation to Texas, where he had contacts in the military installations. Somewhere the Louisiana spirits couldn't follow. Somewhere he could start over with a new name, a new identity, a clean slate. He made it to the docks with one bag and enough money to buy passage on a merchant ship. The mark covered most of his chest, but he'd wrapped it in bandages and told the ship's captain he'd been burned in a warehouse fire. Not entirely a lie. The ship left port at dawn, catching the tide downriver toward the Gulf. DuPont stood at the rail, watching New Orleans recede into the morning mist. For the first time in days, he felt hope. They were 10 miles downriver when the ship stopped moving. Not slowed, stopped, dead in the water despite the current, despite the sails catching good wind. "What's happening?" DuPont demanded, climbing to the quarterdeck where the captain stood staring at his compass. "I don't know," the captain said, his voice shaking. "We should be moving. The wind's good, the current's with us, but it's like we're anchored, like something's holding us." DuPont looked down at the water. They were there, in the river. Dozens of figures standing just beneath the surface, their hands raised, holding the ship in place. Dead slaves, drowned slaves, slaves thrown overboard from the ships DuPont had commanded when he'd supplemented his military pay by hiring out for special cargo runs. They'd been waiting. They knew he'd run, and they'd blocked the only escape route. "Dear God," the captain whispered, seeing them too now. The figures began to rise from the water, emerging onto the deck like swimmers stepping onto a beach. Water streamed from their bodies, but they didn't drip. They didn't breathe. They were beyond such needs now. DuPont drew his sword. "Stay back. I order you to—" One of them, a man who'd died shackled in the hold of a ship DuPont captained 15 years ago, reached out and touched the colonel's chest. Where his finger pressed, the mark blazed with light. DuPont felt his heart clench, felt the same cold grip that had killed Moore and Rousseau and Whitmore. But worse than the pain was the water filling his lungs. Not real water, but the phantom sensation of drowning, of being thrown overboard, of sinking into dark depths while chains pulled him down and down and down. He experienced every death he'd caused, every drowning, every suffocation, every moment of terror as the middle passage claimed another life. It took hours. The captain and crew watched in horror as Colonel DuPont drowned on dry land, his lungs filling with phantom water, his body convulsing with the memory of deaths he'd inflicted. When he finally died, the spirits released the ship and sank back into the river. The vessel lurched forward suddenly, catching the current again, but it was too late. The colonel's body lay on the deck, his face blue, his chest still and grey. The captain turned the ship around. He wanted no part of carrying that corpse to Texas. He wanted no part of whatever curse had followed Marcus DuPont out of New Orleans. Some cargo wasn't worth any price. Senator Armand Laveau lasted the longest. Perhaps because he was the oldest, his heart was stubborn. Perhaps because his sins were legislative rather than personal, written in law books rather than carved into flesh. Or perhaps because, alone among the guests, he tried to make confession. On the 8th day, when the mark had spread across his entire chest and was creeping toward his throat, Laveau summoned Baptiste to his mansion on Esplanade. "I need to see them," he said. "The slaves I've harmed. I need to speak to them." Baptiste regarded him for a long moment. "All of them, Senator. That would take years, decades. Most are dead or sold beyond finding." "Then bring me the ones you can find. The ones still in New Orleans, please." There must have been something in his voice, desperation, true remorse, the knowledge of imminent death, because Baptiste nodded slowly. "I'll try." Over the next 2 days, Baptiste brought them. Not many, a handful, a dozen, survivors of the laws Laveau had written. A woman whose children had been sold away because of a statute Laveau penned. A man who'd been whipped for learning to read, illegal under Laveau's literacy ban. A girl whose mother had died in childbirth because enslaved women weren't allowed medical care, another Laveau provision. One by one they came to his study. One by one he faced them. "I wrote the law that separated your family," he told the woman. "I thought I was protecting social order. I thought I was preserving civilization. I was wrong. I'm sorry." She said nothing, just looked at him with eyes that had cried themselves dry years ago. "I wrote the law that forbade your education," he told the man. "I thought knowledge would make you dangerous, but the real danger was my ignorance, my willful ignorance of your humanity. I'm sorry." The man nodded slowly. "Too late for sorry, Senator, but I hear you." "I wrote the law that denied your mother medical treatment," he told the girl. "She was perhaps 16, her mother dead 2 years. I thought you were property, not people. I thought your suffering didn't matter. I was wrong. I'm profoundly, eternally wrong." The girl's eyes filled with tears. "She called for me when she was dying, called my name for 3 days. They wouldn't let me go to her because of your law, because slave children had to work no matter what." "I know, I'm sorry." "Sorry don't bring her back." "No, it doesn't." They sat in silence for a moment. "Is there anything I can do?" Laveau asked. "Anything at all. I'm dying. You can see the mark. I know what's coming. But before I go, is there any amends I can make?" The girl thought about it. "My little brother," she finally said. "He's 6. He works in the sugar mill. Your laws say he has to work until he's 18. If you could change that, if you could make it so children don't have to—" "I can't change the laws," Laveau interrupted. "I no longer have the authority, but—" He turned to his desk, pulled out paper and pen. "I can free him. Your brother, what's his name?" Thomas. "I can write his freedom papers right now and," he thought quickly, "I can establish a trust. Enough money for his education, his care. It won't undo what was done to your mother, but perhaps—" "You'd do that?" "It's nothing compared to what I've taken, but yes, I'll do it." He wrote quickly, his hand shaking from pain and weakness. Freedom papers for Thomas, a trust in the girl's name, instructions for his lawyer to execute immediately upon his death. The girl took the papers with trembling hands. "I don't forgive you," she said quietly. "I can't, but thank you. For Thomas." After she left, Laveau turned to Baptiste. "Bring more, however many you can find. Quickly. I don't have much time." Baptiste brought more. Through that day and into the night, a procession of the wronged and broken came to Senator Laveau's study. Some he could help directly, writing freedom papers where he had the authority, establishing trusts from his considerable fortune, making provisions in a rapidly written will that would see families reunited, debts forgiven, people liberated. Some he could only apologize to. And they stood there, listening to words that came 20 years too late, 30 years. A lifetime. Some accepted his apology with grace. Some spat at his feet. Some said nothing at all, just looked at him with eyes that held the weight of generations. The mark continued to spread. By midnight it had reached his throat. By dawn it was creeping up his jaw. "There's not enough time," Laveau said to Baptiste, his voice hoarse. "Not enough time to reach them all, to make amends to all of them." "No, Senator, there never was." "Will it matter, what I've done today? Will it change anything when they come for me?" Baptiste looked at him for a long moment. "I don't know. The lower judge as they will. But perhaps dying with your eyes open is better than dying blind." At noon on the 10th day, Senator Armand Laveau died in his study chair, surrounded by the freedom papers he'd written. The mark had covered his face completely, turning him into a grey statue of a man who'd learned too late what his choices cost. The spirits came for him as they'd come for the others. But those who witnessed it, Baptiste, the household staff, some of the people Laveau had freed in his final hours, said it was different. The spirits didn't drag him screaming. They lifted him almost gently, and as they carried him down, some of them, not all, but some, touched him with something that might have been mercy. It was still damnation, but perhaps a lesser damnation than the others had earned. Judge Alistair Crane stood in his courtroom on the 11th day and wondered if he would die here. The mark covered his entire chest. His back was creeping up his neck. The pain was constant, overwhelming, a fire that burned from the inside out. He'd stopped taking laudanum because it didn't help anymore, and he wanted to die with his mind clear, if he was going to die at all. Because unlike the others, Crane had decided not to run, not to hide, not to confess to individuals. If the lower wanted judgment, he would give them judgment, public judgment, complete judgment. He'd used his authority as a judge to call an extraordinary session of court. He'd invited every newspaper in New Orleans. He'd sent word through every channel he could that Judge Alistair Crane had an announcement of profound importance. The courtroom was packed. Journalists, lawyers, citizens, enslaved people given rare permission to attend by curious masters who wanted to know what was happening. Even some of the other guests' families were there, widows seeking answers about their husbands' strange deaths. Crane took the bench. He looked terrible and knew it, grey skin creeping up his neck, face gaunt with pain, eyes fevered, but his voice was steady when he spoke. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, "I called this session to make a confession, not before God, though I should, not before the law, though I've violated it in spirit if not in letter, but before you, the people of New Orleans, the people of Louisiana, the people whose lives I've affected through my authority as a judge." Murmurs rippled through the courtroom. He raised a hand for silence. "For 15 years, I have sat on this bench and dispensed what we call justice. I have sentenced enslaved people to punishments for attempting to be free. I have separated families by legal decree. I have upheld laws that treat human beings as property, and I have told myself I was simply following the law, simply maintaining order, simply doing my duty." He paused, looking at the faces before him, confused, shocked, some beginning to understand. "But 5 nights ago, I participated in something that tore away all my rationalizations. I won't describe it in detail. Some horrors should remain unspoken. But I will say that I, along with several prominent citizens who have since died under mysterious circumstances, engaged in rituals of domination and violation against enslaved people. We called it the Ceremony of Renewal. We believed we were affirming our natural superiority, our right to rule, our godlike authority over those we considered less than human. Gasps, shouts. The courtroom erupted in noise. Crane waited for it to subside. "We were wrong," he continued. "Not just morally wrong, though we were that. Not just legally wrong, though we were that too. We were fundamentally, cosmically wrong. and we have been judged for it by powers older and deeper than any court of law." He pulled back his collar, revealing the grey mark spreading across his skin. "This is judgment. This is the price of believing ourselves gods. My co-participants have died already. You've read about their deaths in the papers, though the true cause has been concealed. I will die soon as well. But before I do, I want to use what authority remains to me to make a record." He pulled out a sheaf of papers, a list he'd spent the last 2 days compiling with the help of his clerk, who looked terrified but had obeyed. "These are the names of every enslaved person whose life I've affected through my judicial decisions. Every sentence I've passed, every family I've separated, every punishment I've authorized. 643 names, 643 people whose humanity I denied. And for each of them, I want to say publicly, I was wrong. I am sorry, and whatever awaits me in death, I deserve it." He began to read the names. Elijah, age 32, sentenced to 50 lashes for attempting to visit his wife on a neighboring plantation without permission. I authorized that punishment. I was wrong. Sarah, age 19, ordered separated from her infant daughter to be sold downriver. I signed that order. I was wrong. Moses, age 45, sentenced to 6 months in chains for teaching his children to read. I imposed that sentence. I was wrong. Name after name, crime after crime, judgment after judgment. The courtroom fell silent as Crane read, his voice growing hoarser, but never stopping. Some of the enslaved people in the gallery began to weep. Some of the white citizens began to leave, uncomfortable with this display, this breaking of social contract that demanded such things never be spoken aloud. But Crane kept reading. Rebecca, age 16. Joseph, age 28. Mary, age 8 years old. He'd authorized her sale away from her parents because the plantation owner needed cash and children were easy to liquidate. His voice broke on that one, but he continued. He read for 3 hours. His voice failed toward the end, dropping to a whisper, but he read every name, all 643 of them. When he finished, he set down the papers and looked at the people remaining in the courtroom. Maybe half had stayed, watching this spectacle of public confession, with expressions ranging from sympathy to horror to grim satisfaction. "That's all I have time for," Crane said. "The judgment is nearly complete. I feel it reaching my heart. But before I go, I want to make one final statement for the record." He stood, swaying slightly, gripping the bench for support. "Slavery is wrong. It is wrong legally, morally, and spiritually. The laws we've written to support it are unjust. The society we've built upon it is corrupt. And every person who participates in it, from the slave catcher to the senator to the judge on the bench, is complicit in a crime against humanity." Shouts now, angry ones. "Traitor! Abolitionist! You're mad!" "Perhaps," Crane agreed. "Mad with guilt, mad with pain, mad with the knowledge of what we've done. But that doesn't make me wrong." He felt it then, the cold hand reaching for his heart, the final moment of the judgment, the spirits manifested in the courtroom, not hiding now, not working in shadow, but appearing in full view of everyone present. The 6 who died in the chapel fire, still wearing their white linen, and behind them dozens more, hundreds more, the accumulated dead of Louisiana's slavery, those who died in the fields, in the holds of ships, under the lash, in childbirth, of despair. They filled the courtroom like a congregation, like a jury, like the true judges they'd always been. Crane looked at them and felt no fear, only exhaustion and something that might have been relief. "I'm ready," he said simply. Delphine stepped forward from among the spirits. She looked as she had in life, young, beautiful, fully human. She reached out and touched the mark on his chest. The cold wrapped around his heart, squeezed, but it was different than the others had experienced. Still painful, it couldn't not be painful, not after what he'd done, but there was something else mixed with the judgment. something that felt almost like acknowledgement. Not forgiveness. He didn't deserve that and wouldn't have accepted it, but acknowledgement that he'd tried at the end to face what he was, what he'd done. "The words don't undo it," Delphine said, her voice echoing strangely in the courtroom. "But they matter. They're recorded now, written down. People heard." "Will it change anything?" Crane asked, feeling his heartbeat slow. "That's for the living to decide." His vision was going grey now, tunneling down. He saw the courtroom as if from a great distance, the shocked faces, the weeping, the journalists frantically scribbling notes that would spread this story across the city, across the South, across the nation. Maybe it would change something, maybe not. But at least he'd spoken the truth before the end. His last thought before the cold claimed him completely was, "I hope someone remembers. I hope someone learns." Then Judge Alistair Crane's heart stopped, and the judgment was complete. The story of Judge Crane's courtroom confession spread like wildfire through New Orleans. Within hours, newsboys were shouting headlines on every corner. "Judge dies after bizarre confession. Prominent citizens implicated in slave ritual. The mark of judgment. 5 dead in mysterious plague." The newspapers couldn't agree on what had actually happened. The more conservative papers called it mass hysteria, a shared delusion brought on by summer heat and yellow fever. The abolitionist papers in the North seized on it as proof of slavery's corrupting influence. The religious papers debated whether it was divine judgment or demonic possession. But in the slave quarters of every plantation, in the hidden churches where free people of color gathered, in the cramped rooms above shops on Rampart Street where voodoo priestesses practiced their art, everyone knew the truth. The Loa had spoken, and they were not finished speaking. Evangeline Beauregard stood in the ruins of her chapel 3 days after Crane's death. The mark had reached her throat, was creeping up her jaw. She had perhaps a day left, maybe less. She'd spent those days trying to understand, not to escape. She knew that was impossible, but to understand what she'd done, what she'd unleashed, what it meant. Baptiste found her there at dawn, standing in the ash circle that remained perfectly intact despite the rain, despite the fire, despite everything. The ash was darker now, enriched with blood and judgment. "Madam," he said quietly, "there are people here to see you." "I'm not receiving visitors. I think you should see these ones." She turned, irritated, ready to dismiss him. But then she saw who stood behind him. Priestesses, 3 of them, old women whose eyes held the weight of centuries, whose skin was marked with the scars of tribal rituals that predated the Middle Passage. They wore simple dresses, but carried themselves like queens, and around their necks hung gris-gris bags and fetishes that seemed to pulse with power. The eldest stepped forward. Her name was Marie Laveau, not the famous voodoo queen who would take that name later, but her grandmother, a woman who'd been enslaved, freed herself, and become keeper of the old ways that neither Christianity nor slavery could erase. "Evangeline Beauregard," she said, her voice like iron wrapped in honey, "do you know what you've done?" "I tried to control them," Evangeline whispered. "The lower. I thought if I gave them offerings." "You gave them nothing," Marie interrupted. "You took. You violated. You desecrated everything the spirits represent. Protection of the helpless, justice for the wronged, balance in all things. And then you dared to think you could bind them to your will." "I have their blood," Evangeline said, defensive even now. "My grandmother was—" "Your grandmother would be ashamed." Marie's voice cracked like a whip. "She taught you the ways, yes. But she also taught you respect, taught you that the spirits are not servants, but forces of nature as vast and terrible as the ocean. You ignored those teachings. You used what you learned to oppress instead of liberate. You became the very thing the lower exist to oppose." Evangeline felt tears on her cheeks, though she couldn't remember starting to cry. "I was trying to survive. In this world, a woman like me, neither white enough nor black enough, has to make alliances, has to find power where she can—" By crushing those beneath you. The second priestess spoke now, her voice younger, but no less forceful. By becoming overseer of your own people. They were never my people, Evangeline said bitterly. I was never allowed to claim them, never allowed to acknowledge. She stopped, the truth hitting her like a physical blow. I was never allowed, so I made sure they suffered for it. God help me, I punished them for my own shame. Silence in the ruined chapel. The morning light slanted through the broken walls, illuminating the ash circle, making it look like a portal to somewhere deep and dark. At least you see it now, Marie said, her voice softer. That's more than the others managed. Can you help me? Evangeline asked. Can you intercede with the Eloah, ask for mercy? No. Marie shook her head. The judgment is set. The mark is spreading. You will die, Evangeline Beauregard, and you will face what you've done. But, she paused, considering, you can perhaps choose how you face it. What do you mean? The men who died before you ran, hid, or tried to bargain. Only Judge Crane chose to witness, to speak truth, to make a record. The Loa acknowledged that. It didn't save him, but it mattered. So I should confess? Like he did? No, the third priestess said, speaking for the first time. She was the youngest, perhaps 40, with eyes that seemed to see through flesh to whatever lay beneath. Your confession needs to be different. You don't just need to acknowledge what you've done, you need to break what you've built. Evangeline understood immediately. Belle Chêne. This plantation is a monument to suffering, Marie said. Built on stolen land with stolen labor, maintained by pain and violation. As long as it stands as testimony to what you chose, what you valued, what you became. You want me to destroy it? We want you to free it. Free the people you hold in bondage. Deed them the land they've worked for generations. Burn the big house if you have to, but break the system that made Belle Chêne possible. Die having unmade what you made. Evangeline looked at Baptiste, who'd stood silent through this entire exchange. And you, is this what you want? It's not about what I want, madame. His voice was careful, neutral. It's about what's right. I'll have nothing left. No home, no wealth, no legacy. You have nothing now, Marie said bluntly. You're dying. You're damned. The only question is whether you'll die having done one true thing, or whether you'll cling to your monuments of shame until the very end. Evangeline closed her eyes. The mark burned across her throat, a collar of judgment she'd placed on herself. She thought of her mother, who died in this house, neither free nor enslaved, but trapped in between. She thought of her grandmother, who'd tried to teach her the old ways, and would indeed be ashamed of what Evangeline had done with that knowledge. She thought of Delphine and the 5 others who'd died in this chapel, who'd chosen immolation over continued violation, who'd called down the Loa's judgment, knowing it would consume them too. They'd been braver than her, more honest, more human. All right, she said quietly, tell me what I need to do. By noon, Belle Chêne was in organized chaos. Evangeline had called every enslaved person on the plantation to the big house. All 83 of them, field workers, house servants, children, elderly, everyone. They gathered on the lawn, confused and frightened, because mass gatherings usually meant punishment was coming. Instead, Evangeline stood on the gallery and made the announcement that would end her legacy. You're free, she said simply, all of you. I'm signing freedom papers for everyone. Baptiste has them ready. He'll distribute them this afternoon. Silence. The enslaved people looked at each other, not daring to believe. Furthermore, Evangeline continued, her voice growing hoarse as the mark crept up her jaw, I'm deeding you the land. Belle Chêne will be divided equally among all of you. The fields you've worked, the cabins you've lived in, all of it, yours, legally and permanently. Why? Someone shouted from the crowd. Why now? Evangeline touched the grey mark on her throat. Because I'm dying, and I'm trying at the last possible moment to do something right. It's a trick, another voice called. She's lying. No trick, Baptiste said, stepping forward with a thick sheaf of papers. I have the deeds here, drawn up by 3 different lawyers to make sure they're legal. I have the freedom papers, and I have instructions for transferring all assets, tools, equipment, livestock, to your collective ownership. He paused, then added quietly, I have my own freedom papers too. And my portion of land, Madame, is freeing all of us. The silence broke then. Questions erupted, people shouting over each other, some crying, some angry, some still not believing. Marie Laveau stepped forward, raising her hands for quiet. The crowd fell silent. Everyone knew her, respected her, feared her in the way you fear someone who speaks truth without compromise. It's real, she said. I've examined the documents. They're legal and binding. By nightfall, none of you will be enslaved. By week's end, you'll own the land you've worked. But what about the big house, someone asked. What about all her fancy things? Evangeline smiled grimly. Take what you need. Tools, furniture, anything useful. The rest, she looked at the white columns, the crystal chandeliers visible through the windows, all the trappings of wealth built on suffering. The rest burns. You're going to burn Belle Chêne? Baptiste stared at her. The chapel burned. Why not the house? Why not all of it? Why leave any monument to what this place was? She turned to Marie. Isn't that what you meant? Break what I built? It is. Marie acknowledged. But I didn't think you'd take it quite so literally. I'm dying. I might as well be dramatic about it. Evangeline laughed, and it turned into a cough. When she pulled her hand away from her mouth, there was blood on her fingers. The mark was reaching her lips now. We need to do this quickly, she said. Baptiste, start distributing the papers. Everyone else, you have until sunset to take what you need from the house. After that, she looked at the priestesses, we burn it all. The afternoon dissolved into surreal activity. Enslaved people, free people now, though the knowledge hadn't quite sunk in, moved through Belle Chêne taking what they needed. Practical things mostly. Kitchen equipment, farm tools, sturdy furniture, blankets. Some took small luxuries, a silver candlestick, a porcelain teacup, things that represented the life they'd served but never been allowed to touch as their own. Evangeline sat in her study, signing freedom papers, name after name, signature after signature, until her hand cramped and the mark had spread across half her face. Madame, Baptiste said quietly, you should rest. I'll rest soon enough, permanently. She signed another paper, sprinkled sand to dry the ink. How many left? 15. Then we have time. But they didn't, not really. She could feel her heartbeat becoming irregular, feel the cold fingers reaching for her center. The judgment was nearly complete. She signed the last paper as the sun touched the western horizon. The mark covered her face completely now, turning her into a grey mask of herself. It's done, she said, setting down the pen. Everyone free, everyone has land. What happens next is up to them. And what happens to you, Baptiste asked. I die. And then, she smiled with grey lips, then I face what I've done, properly, completely, without any of the illusions I've hidden behind all these years. She stood, swaying. Baptiste caught her arm. Let me help you outside, he said. You should see it burn. It's your right. My right? She laughed. I have no rights, but yes, I want to see it. They walked together through the house she'd ruled for 15 years. Through rooms where she'd entertained the cream of New Orleans society, where she'd plotted and schemed and built her power, where she'd hosted the ceremonies that had finally brought her down, all empty now, all echoing, all waiting for the fire. On the front lawn, the freed people had gathered, carrying torches. Marie Laveau stood at their head, and when she saw Evangeline emerge, she nodded once. Are you ready? Yes. Marie handed her a torch. Then you should be the one to start it. You built this place. You should be the one to unmake it. Evangeline took the torch, feeling its weight, its heat. She looked at Belle Chêne, the white columns, the galleries, the windows that glowed in the sunset like the eyes of something that didn't want to die. "Burn it," she said to the crowd. "Burn all of it. But one thing," she turned to Baptiste, "the portraits in the gallery, my mother's portrait. Save that one, just that one." He nodded and ran inside, returning moments later with a painting of a beautiful woman with skin the color of café au lait and eyes that held both sadness and defiance. Evangeline's mother, who'd never been allowed to be wife or widow, never allowed to be white or black, but forced to exist in the painful space between. "Thank you," Evangeline whispered. Then she threw her torch through the front window. The fire caught instantly, as if Belle Chêne had been waiting to burn, eager for it. Within minutes, flames were racing through the house, consuming velvet and silk, crystal and silver, all the beautiful things that had been purchased with pain. The freed people threw their torches too, until Belle Chêne was engulfed, a tower of flame rising into the darkening sky. Evangeline watched it burn, feeling the mark complete its journey to her heart. The pain was extraordinary, but so was the sight. All her power, all her carefully constructed identity, all the monuments to her survival melting into ash. "It's beautiful," she said, and meant it. The spirits came then, not just the 6 from the chapel, but hundreds, everyone who'd suffered at Belle Chêne over 3 generations, everyone who'd died in these fields, everyone who'd been broken in this house. They materialized around the burning building like a congregation witnessing resurrection, or maybe damnation. It was hard to tell the difference. Delphine stepped forward from among the spirits. She looked at Evangeline with eyes that held neither forgiveness nor hatred, just evaluation. "You broke it," she said simply. "I built it. I had to break it. It doesn't undo what you did, the ceremonies, the pain, the deaths. I know, but it's something. It's—" Evangeline felt her heart stuttering. "It's all I had left to give." Delphine considered this. Then she reached out and took Evangeline's hand, the first time she'd ever touched her mistress as an equal, as a person with agency and choice. "Come on then," she said quietly. "Time to face what comes next." The cold wrapped around Evangeline's heart and squeezed. But it was different than she'd feared. Still judgment, she was still damned, still being called to account for decades of cruelty, but there was something else mixed in, something that felt almost like acknowledgement. She'd broken what she'd built, she'd freed what she'd enslaved, she'd unmade her monuments. It didn't earn forgiveness, but it earned witness. It earned the truth that she'd tried, at the last possible moment, to do one right thing. Evangeline Beauregard died standing, watching Belle Chêne burn, surrounded by the spirits of those she'd wronged and the free people she'd finally released. Her last words were, "Mother, I'm sorry. I tried to be safe. I tried to survive. I became a monster instead." Then her heart stopped, and the spirits took her down to judgment, but they took her by the hand, not by the throat. And in the grand scheme of damnation, that mattered. The morning after Belle Chêne burned, New Orleans woke to find its social order shaken to its foundations. 5 prominent citizens dead under mysterious circumstances. A judge's public confession implicating the elite in unspeakable acts. A plantation burned, and its enslaved population freed, given land, made into something unthinkable. Property owners. The conservative newspapers called it madness, anarchy, the end of civilization. They demanded investigations, arrests, someone to blame for the collapse of proper order, but the people they wanted to arrest were already dead. And the people they wanted to re-enslave had legal documents, properly executed and witnessed, that said they were free. The abolitionist papers in the North seized on the story with righteous fury. "The mark of God's judgment," declared one headline. "Slavery supporters die in mysterious plague. Divine retribution for inhuman system," read another. Religious papers debated whether it was truly God's work or something darker. "Voodoo," they whispered. "African magic. the revenge of pagan spirits. They were all right and all wrong. It was judgment, but not the kind that fit neatly into Christian theology or rational explanation. It was older than that, deeper than that, true as the laws that governed hurricanes and earthquakes and all the forces humans couldn't control, only endure. In the cramped offices of the New Orleans Tribune, a young journalist named Marcus Webb sat at his desk, sorting through his notes from Judge Crane's courtroom confession. He'd been there, seen the whole thing, watched a man die while speaking truth that powerful people wanted buried. Marcus was 23 years old, free-born, educated in France, where his skin color mattered less, and burning with the kind of righteous anger that makes revolutionaries. He'd watched slavery destroy his people for his entire life. He'd watched justice corrupted, families broken, humanity denied. And now he'd watched something impossible. The system eating its own, judgment coming not from distant abolitionists or angry God, but from something closer, darker, more immediate. He had to write about it, had to get the truth down before it was rewritten by people who needed the old order to continue. His editor, a grizzled white man named Thompson, who'd learned to hate slavery the hard way by seeing it up close and not being able to look away, stood over his shoulder. "You sure about this, Marcus? This story is going to make enemies. Powerful ones. Some people want this whole thing buried with those 5 men. That's exactly why it needs to be told." Marcus dipped his pen in ink. Those men confessed. Judge Crane read 600 names. He said slavery was wrong from that bench, in that courtroom, as an act of judicial record. If we don't document it, if we don't write it down and spread it, they'll pretend it never happened. And the supernatural elements? The mark, the spirits, the fire? Marcus paused, considering. We report what people saw, what people experienced. Let readers draw their own conclusions about what it means. But we don't hide it. We don't rationalize it away. We let the strangeness stand, because maybe that's part of the truth too. Thompson nodded slowly. All right, write it. I'll publish it. And then we'll both probably lose our jobs and possibly our lives. Better than losing our souls. Marcus began to write. Not a dry recitation of facts, but a story. The story of Belle Chêne, of the ceremonies, of judgment coming for those who thought themselves above it. He wrote about the mark spreading across skin, about spirits manifesting in courtrooms, about fires that consumed monuments to cruelty. He wrote truth, and it was terrifying. The story ran in the Tribune 3 days later, taking up the entire front page and 3 interior pages. Within hours, it was being reprinted in abolitionist papers across the North. Within days, it had reached Europe. Within weeks, it had become one of the most infamous documents of the slavery debate. Proof to some that God opposed the institution, to others that abolitionism was rooted in superstition and hysteria. But to the enslaved people throughout the South, reading it in secret or hearing it read aloud in hidden gatherings, it meant something else entirely. It meant the lower were watching. It meant judgment was possible. It meant that power, no matter how absolute it seemed, could be toppled by forces the powerful didn't even believe existed. It meant hope. On the land that had been Belle Chêne, the freed people began to build, not a plantation. They would never recreate that horror, but a community. They divided the land into family plots, built proper houses to replace the cabins, established schools where children could learn to read without fear of the lash. They called it Freeman's Hope. Baptiste became their unofficial leader, using his literacy and his knowledge of the law to help navigate the complex process of establishing themselves as legal landowners. He fought off attempts by neighboring plantations to challenge their deeds, found lawyers willing to defend freed people's rights, and slowly, painfully, carved out a space where former slaves could live as human beings. It wasn't easy. Louisiana law still favored enslavers. The community faced constant harassment, threats, attempts to intimidate them back into submission. Some nights they took turns keeping watch, armed with whatever weapons they could cobble together, protecting what they'd been given. But they held on. In the ruins of the chapel they built a memorial, not to Evangeline, not to Belle Chêne, but to the 6 who'd died there. Delphine and her companions who'd called down judgment, knowing it would consume them too. 6 stones arranged in a circle, each carved with a name. And in the center, kept clear and clean, the ash circle remained. It never washed away, never faded, just stayed there like a permanent mark on the earth. Some nights, people swore they heard singing coming from the chapel ruins. The same song the 6 had sung as they died, the same calling to the lower. It wasn't frightening, not to the people of Freeman's Hope. It was comforting, a reminder that they were protected, that forces deeper than slavery watched over them. The lower had judged, and they were still watching. In the study of Laveau Mansion on Esplanade, now owned by the senator's widow, a gathering was taking place. 10 men sat in leather chairs, sipping brandy, discussing the future of Louisiana in low, careful voices. They were the next generation of power, younger brothers and sons of the men who'd died, politicians who'd risen to fill empty seats, businessmen who'd inherited empires. They knew what had happened at Belle Chêne. They'd heard the rumors, read the confessions, watched their fathers or brothers die with grey marks on their skin, and they were trying to decide what it meant for them. It was mass hysteria, said one, Whitmore's nephew, who'd inherited the shipping business. Nothing more. Some kind of poison may be administered by vengeful slaves. We should increase security, crack down harder. Did you not read Crane's confession? Interrupted another, DuPont's younger brother, now wearing the colonel's rank. He named names. He described the ceremonies. If that testimony stands, if it's accepted as truth, then we're all implicated, finished a third, Rousseau's son, who'd inherited his father's medical practice. The sons paying for the sins of fathers, unless we discredit it somehow. How? Demanded Moore's nephew. The man died in open court with 100 witnesses. Journalists documented everything. The story's already spread across the country. Then we changed the narrative, said a new voice. All turned to look at the speaker, a man in his 50s, lawyer named Beaumont, who'd served as legal counsel to most of the dead men. He'd been invited to this meeting to provide guidance, and he spoke with the authority of someone who'd spent decades protecting powerful people from the consequences of their actions. We acknowledge that something happened, Beaumont continued. We admit that there were gatherings, that there were indiscretions, but we frame it as the work of one woman, Evangeline Beauregard, mixed race, history of voodoo practice, clearly unstable. She seduced these men, manipulated them, used drugs and deception to make them participate in her rituals. You want to blame it all on Evangeline? DuPont's brother frowned. She's dead. She can't defend herself. Precisely. Beaumont smiled. She's dead. Her plantation is burned. Her name is already infamous. We make her the villain, the seductive enchantress who corrupted good men, led them to sin, and was ultimately destroyed by her own evil practices. And the supernatural elements? Whitmore's nephew asked. The mark, the spirits, mass hysteria induced by drug use. Ergot poisoning, perhaps, or some African plant she imported for her rituals. The deaths were caused by guilt and psychological trauma, nothing more. Men of conscience driven to despair by their manipulation and abuse. Silence as the men considered this. Then Rousseau's son spoke carefully. And what about Freeman's Hope? The freed slaves with legal deeds to Belle Chêne land. Beaumont's expression hardened. That's more complicated. The deeds are legal. I've examined them myself. But we can make life difficult. Economic pressure, social isolation, vigilante action if necessary. Eventually they'll sell the land back at a fraction of its worth, or they'll simply abandon it. Give them 5 years. 10 at most. You're sure? DuPont's brother pressed. I'm sure. Freed people can't survive in Louisiana, no matter what papers they hold. The system won't allow it. More silence. Then, one by one, the men nodded. It was a plan. It gave them cover, protected their interests, maintained the social order, and it required only one sacrifice, a dead woman's reputation, which seemed a small price. Agreed then, Whitmore's nephew said. We blame Beauregard, minimize the supernatural elements, and pressure Freeman's hope until it collapses. The old order continues. To the old order, the others echoed, raising their glasses. But as they drank, none of them noticed the temperature in the room drop. None of them saw the shadows in the corners grow darker, more substantial. None of them felt the attention that had turned toward them, ancient, patient, implacable attention from forces that had judged their fathers and found them wanting. The lower were still watching, and they had long memories. 3 months later, on a cold November night, Marcus Webb sat in his boarding-house room, sorting through letters. The Tribune had been forced to close after publishing his story about Belle Chêne. Thompson had been run out of New Orleans by economic pressure and death threats. Marcus had lost his job, his apartment, and most of his friends, white ones anyway, who couldn't risk association with someone who'd become a pariah. But the letters kept coming, from enslaved people who'd heard the story read aloud and found hope in it, from abolitionists who wanted more details, more evidence, more ammunition for their cause, from freed people across the South who were trying to build their own freemen's hopes and needed guidance, encouragement, proof that it was possible. And tonight, a different kind of letter. Marcus opened it carefully. The paper was expensive, the handwriting elegant. It read, Mr. Webb, you don't know me, but I was present in Judge Crane's courtroom the day of his confession. I am a slaveholder. I won't pretend otherwise or hide behind euphemism. I own 37 people on a rice plantation south of Charleston. I want you to know that your article changed something in me. I cannot explain it rationally. I cannot defend it to my peers or my family. But I have decided to free them, all of them, and to deed them the land, as Evangeline Beauregard did. I don't expect praise for this. I don't expect forgiveness. A man does not deserve credit for ceasing to do evil. But I wanted you to know that words matter. Truth matters. Your article, Judge Crane's confession, it planted something that I cannot now uproot. Perhaps I am a coward, making this decision only now that I've seen what judgment looks like. Perhaps I should have known better all along, but at least I am acting, while I still have time to act. Use this letter however you see fit. Publish it, burn it, I don't care. I just wanted you to know that the story of Belle Chêne is still spreading, still changing minds, still making men question what they thought was unquestionable. Sincerely, a reader. Marcus set down the letter, his hands trembling slightly. Then he reached for another and another. 5 letters total, all similar. All from slaveholders who'd read about Belle Chêne and decided to free their people. 5 out of how many thousands? It was a drop in the ocean. It wouldn't end slavery. It barely made a dent, but it was something. He began to write a response, knowing he'd never mail it. These letters were anonymous, untraceable, but he needed to put his thoughts into words anyway. Dear readers, what happened at Belle Chêne was terrible and strange and true. 5 men died for their sins. A woman burned her legacy to ash. And maybe, just maybe, something in the world shifted. I don't know if the mark was supernatural or psychological. I don't know if the lower are real or if they're just names we give to justice when it finally arrives. But I know this. Evil has consequences. Power corrupts. And systems built on human suffering cannot stand forever. Someday, maybe not in my lifetime, maybe not in yours, but someday, slavery will end. It will end because it's unsustainable, because it's wrong, because the universe itself rebels against that level of cruelty. Belle Chêne was a preview, a warning, a reminder that judgment comes, whether we believe in it or not. To those of you who are making changes, freeing people, trying to do right even though it costs you everything, thank you. Your courage matters. To those of you still clinging to the old ways, still defending the indefensible, still believing you're above judgment, the Loa are watching, and they are patient, but they are not forgiving. Choose wisely. He signed it, but didn't mail it. Instead, he folded it carefully and placed it in his journal, next to all his notes about Belle Chêne, about the ceremonies, about judgment and redemption, and the terrible price of both. Someday, he thought, historians would want to know what really happened. Someday, when slavery was finally dead and buried, people would ask, how did we survive it? How did we resist? What gave us hope? And he would have an answer for them. We survived because we believed in justice, even when justice seemed impossible. We resisted because we knew the Loa were watching. We hoped because we saw that power, no matter how absolute, could fall. Belle Chêne fell, and with it, something in the architecture of slavery cracked. Not enough to bring it down, not yet. But enough to show it could be done. In Freeman's hope, Baptiste stood in the chapel ruins as the first snow of winter began to fall. Rare this far south, a blessing or an omen, depending on how you read it. The 6 stones stood in their circle, covered now with flowers and offerings. People came here to pray, to remember, to ask the Loa for protection and guidance. It had become a shrine, a place of power, a reminder of what the 6 had sacrificed and what they'd achieved. Baptiste placed his own offering, a candle, a cup of water, a piece of bread. Simple things, but given with respect, with acknowledgement of the forces that had judged Belle Chêne and found it wanting. Thank you, he said quietly to the stones, to the spirits, to whatever presence lingered in this place, for seeing us, for protecting us, for making them pay. The wind rustled through the ruins, and for a moment Baptiste could have sworn he heard singing. That same song Delphine and the others had sung as the fire consumed them. Not mournful now, but triumphant, victorious. They'd won something that night. Not freedom for everyone. That would take a war, would take decades more of struggle. But they'd won acknowledgement. They'd forced power to face itself, to see what it had done, to pay for its crimes. And they'd proven something vital, that the enslaved were not powerless, that they had allies in realms the enslavers didn't believe existed. That judgment was possible, even inevitable. We'll keep your memory, Baptiste promised the 6. We'll tell your story. We'll make sure Freeman's hope survives, that your sacrifice meant something. The singing faded, but the presence remained. Warm, protective, patient. The Loa were still watching, and Baptiste knew with certainty that defied rational explanation that Freeman's hope would survive. Not easily, not without struggle, but it would survive. Because it had been born from sacrifice, consecrated by judgment, protected by forces older than slavery itself. He turned and walked back toward the community, toward the new houses being built, toward the school where children were learning to read, toward the future that 6 people had died to make possible. Behind him, the chapel ruins stood silent in the falling snow, but they weren't empty. They would never be empty. They were a reminder, a warning, a promise. Evil has consequences. Power corrupts, and judgment, when it comes, is absolute.